Thank you very much, Joseph. Honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I have a hard copy of my paper if you want. Shouldn't take more than 25 minutes. I came to know about Levinas by accident. It was 2014. I was doing my PhD in philosophy of education at Florida State University, trying to find a philosophy of dialogue. I am a teacher at heart and believe that dialogue is the ethical way to relate to students. In a presentation of one of my classes, I quoted Martin Buber saying, dialogue is not to be identified with love, but love without dialogue, without real outgoing to the other, reaching to the other, the love remaining with itself. This is called Lucifer. My teacher, Stacy Rutledge, commented and referred me to a Buber scholar at Florida State University if I were to pursue more about philosophy of dialogue. That scholar was Martin Kafka at the religion department. Beside my PhD in philosophy of education, I was also pursuing my master's in philosophy in the philosophy department, which was analytic in its scope. Now it was the religion department's turn. I contacted Kafka, and he was generous enough to accept a one-to-one study with him for a semester. We would meet once a week to discuss one of Buber's books. By the end of the semester, Kafka told me that Buber was not really his guy. He stood up and brought a book from his library with a photo on it. It was the first time I saw a photo of Levinas. This is my guy, said Kafka. The first meeting with Levinas is linguistic. His language is strange, even when you read it, as in my case, translated into English. This linguistic quality is missed if reduced to a mere jargon. No, it's his way of communication. Maybe not even that, but rather a certain kind of language that shows you something. The first linguistic experience you encounter with studying Levinas is speaking in a strange way. If you come from a mainstream philosophy, you need to let go of words like consciousness, deduction, argument, rationality, or more accurately, you must use them very differently. You begin using words such as other, face, hospitality, laity, and asymmetry, which makes you sound somewhat religious, poetic, but not really. You, the speaker, and those who listen to you witness something different. In other words, connecting with the Levinas philosophy means to speak and write differently, and more importantly, to listen and read differently. It's often said that Otherwise Than Being is Levinas's major work on language. It is where he confronts the impossibility of doing philosophy without using the language of philosophy. This is the impossibility Derrida noticed in his 1967 paper, Violence and Metaphysics. Kafka's own version of this impossibility was asking, is he going to shoot his own foot? It's almost funny that Levinas names the first part of Otherwise Than Being the argument. One of the very words you are warned to avoid or critically reflect upon from the start. Let's listen to that word again. The dictionary says argument is an exchange of diverging or opposite views, typically a heated or angry one. It also says in the Middle English, the process of reasoning comes from Old French, make clear, prove, use. Make it clear to whom? The other? Accuse whom? The self? The word argument is commonly translated into Arabic as hijaj, an interesting word. Let's us listen to it a bit. The verb hajja means both. First, to prove a point or to win an argument. Second, to go on a pilgrimage, which means qasd, to approach someone or something. In English, the word pilgrim comes from Middle English, from Latin to mean foreign. Phenomenologists shouldn't argue. They should describe, show, and refer. What did the word argument reveal to us? What did we hear? Maybe not the first sound, maybe it's infantile one. It's remarkable that the word infant in English comes from the Middle English, from Old French, to mean unable to speak. Unable to speak, yet the loudest in ethical terms. Nothing has the ethical force similar to the cry of an infant. Holding a baby in your arms may be the greatest responsibility in your life. Nothing carries ethical weight like a photo of a hungry baby. An elderly British woman once told me she lost her faith gradually after seeing the photos of starving children in Africa in the late 70s and early 80s. I wouldn't be surprised if the problem of evil was renewed at a different level once those images of dead and starving children entered the international public sphere. All the above is a result of listening to the word argument in the dictionary. Let's keep this in mind. In Otherwise Than Being, we are introduced to saying and the said. The said refers to the actual content, propositions, or linguistic structures produced in communication. It's the articulated thematic expression of meaning with a system of signs and concepts. Saying, as Levinas says, antecedent to the semantic glimmerings, forward preceding language. It's the proximity of one to the other, the commitment of an approach, the one for the other, the very signifyingness of signification. He says also, it's the pre-original saying that moves into language, in which saying and the said are correlated of one another, and the saying is subordinated to its theme. This pre-original saying moves, as Levinas says. We heard about movement a lot today. It moves into language where it's betrayed. Movement is interesting. What does it mean for something to move or to be moved? Movement is spatial. It's written special, but it's spatial. Even when emotional, when we are moved by a speech, for instance, we travel somewhere else, existentially speaking. Movement is innocent. We remember William James and the leap of faith embedded in every step we take. That faith which sustains the laws of physics, at least for one more step. However, this movement, according to Levinas, leads to subordination, a betrayal. And that's why we need reduction of the said back to saying, another journey, another faith. It's also surprising to read Levinas advocating for a reduction. We know reductionism is a problem in philosophy. Reducing everything to biology, it's the problem with Hitlerism and to ontology in Hegel, for example. In this critique of reductionism, reduction means a kind of closure and limitation, ignoring infinity, sign of totality. However, the word reduction promises something different. We hear this promise in Jean-Luc Marion's famous claim, the more reduction, the more givenness. The word reduction has conveyed something similar long ago. In the late Middle English, denoting the action of bringing back from Old French, meaning bring back, restore. Reduction is usually translated into Arabic as rad, which means response, and given back. Rad here means to respond to a call and to give something back, which involves movement, a trip back to something prior. This reduction of the said back to saying is the mission Levinas sees for philosophy. He says everything shows itself in the surprise of this betrayal, even the unsayable. In this betrayal, the indiscretion with regard to the unsayable, which is probably the very task of philosophy, becomes possible. Who can help? Language, of course. Which language? Poetic and prophetic said. Levinas tells us later in his book that language would exceed the limits of what is taught by suggesting, let him be understood without even making understandable, an implication of meaning distinct from that which comes to sign from the simultaneity of systems or the logical definition of concepts. This impossibility is laid bare in the poetic said, and the interpretation it calls for ad infinitum. It's shown in prophetic said, scorning its conditions in sort of levitation. The poetic said, in its calling for endless interpretation, and the prophetic said, in its exceeding all conditions. Poetic and prophetic said, as commonly understood, are rare. Are we heading toward what could be called a linguistic elitism, where only poems by Paul Celan or Rimbaud and religious texts have the possibility of helping philosophy achieve this reduction of the said back to the saying, the journey back to the approach of the other? That doesn't sound like Levinas. With whom do we find ethics, the first philosophy, in simple gestures, such as after you, sir? I propose here a kind of listening that might allow us to hear the saying again in all language, ordinary language, I mean, everyday communication. Oddly enough, Heidegger might help. He says, poetry proper is never merely a higher mode of everyday language. It's rather the reverse. Everyday language is a forgotten and therefore used up poem, from which there hardly resounds a call any longer. If this is true, then the reduction of the said to saying, listening, is a kind of remembrance, a remembrance that reduces the forgotten and used up to a newborn saying, a saying that is not yet able to speak, yet its sound is loud in ethical terms. This remembering isn't a remembering of a specific event or a person, but a remembrance as a calling the words to speak again by waiting in a mode of listening. The dictionary tells us the verb to remember comes from Middle English, from Old French, from Latin to mean call to mind, from Latin also to mean mindful. It's this call for ethical relationship, the approach of the other, where listening becomes a prayer. Still, people, when trying to remember someone's name, this is common in Arabic. When people try to remember someone's name, they pray, may God give me his name. This word tadhakkara in Arabic, which means remembrance, shares the same root with the word dhikr, which is verbal prayer. The Quran itself is called dhikr. This listening doesn't rely on a specific context. We might go further and say it frees words from being contained in any context. In this listening, the word becomes the baby it is. Babies, as we say, are born color blind and innocent cultural constructions. If poetic and prophetic language call for infinite interpretation and transcendence of all conditions, ordinary language calls for innocent listening, infantile listening again to the friendship, to the womb of words. In this innocence, saying and the said need not be separated or even distinguished. The word itself is the event where everything happens. Levinas quotes Paul Celan saying, there is no any basic difference between a handshake and a poem. The handshake is an event. The word as an event calls for the word as the gift. Levinas says in Totality and Infinity, to thematize is to offer the world to the other in speech. We know that thematizing the said is a betrayal which is now a giving, an offering. The dictionary tells us something interesting about the verb to betray. From Middle English, thoroughly plus absolute, betray from Old French, based on Latin, to mean hand over. To betray is to hand over. One of the oldest metaphors of the newborns is being a gift. It's interesting to remember that handing over may be one of the first acts we do with babies. Midwifing is handing over newborns. Are we now back to Socrates and philosophy as midwifing? Not the midwifing we find in Menu, where Socrates already knows what the boy will say. Teaching, says Levinas, is not reducible to myotics. It comes from the exterior and brings me more than I contain. Proper midwifing is to receive from the exterior more than you contain, and to hand over what you receive. That is subjectivity proper. Ordinary language is commonplace, where every word is a gift. Language is handing over words. I mean, even these words in the dictionary, out of context. In each of them, infant poetry waits to be remembered. We learned above that being an infant means being unable to speak, yet capable of saying. The reference to the dictionary here is no more than a reference to the world of language in its ordinary sense, a reference to an encounter where one person spoke to another, to the poetic and the prophetic of speaking and listening themselves. When speaking, one allows a long history of human communication to go through one's being. That is poetic, a channeling of another sound, a gift, midwifing. Language is prophetic, prophesying without knowledge. Mere faith in the hospitality of the other, that the future will be together. Again, let's listen to the word prophet in its infancy. It comes from Old English, via Latin, from Greek, to mean interpreter or expounder, from pro, before, and thetis, speaker, from speak. We call Heidegger saying, speaking is listening prior to speaking. Prophets are the sound and silence of listening. Levinas says language is already skepticism. skepticism of complete expression, perhaps. But language is faith too, the faith we find in poetry and prophecy, faith in the other, that faith in friendship. If language is skepticism because it allows for the otherwise than being, where being means one possible meaning, it's also otherwise than being, where being means violence. Here, language is faith and peace. Finally, in the poetic set, if the poetic set resists epistemological totalization by breathing the infinity of interpretations, and if the prophetic set resists ontological domination by marking all limitations, the everyday set holds the infant poetry of words, so infant that it does not yet have a sound, yet it calls. It sounds soundlessly, a new sound maybe, free and flying. Social and cultural practices and everyday communications hold that infancy and are ready to hand over to us. It's a matter of listening then, a listening in the form of open hands, ready to receive and hand over again. Today, with the rise of technological marketing, language is central. On one side, this marketing relies on language. On the other, language seems to hold the only way out of it. In recent years, I have undergone a linguistic turn. Not that I studied language or developed a philosophy of language, but because I started listening differently, not only to poetry and other forms of art, but also to the everyday words that hold our communication together. These words promise to lead us to a different modes of existence where ethical relationships speak to us. For example, and I conclude, for example, today in Saudi Arabia, a new language describes the relationship with camels as ownership. Those who have camels call themselves owners. But the earlier language names this relationship differently. Being with camels was a kind of caring, ri'aya. Those who had camels called themselves carers, ra'a. Another naming is familial. Those who had camels called themselves family of camels, or camel people, Ahl al-Ibn. Honors, carers, and family, three namings, each calling for a deep listening. Being common in ordinary language is crucial. It shows how deep the relationship between self and other truly is, how original the ethical relationship in our connection with other beings. This openness to ordinary language and its extended relationships to animals and to nature might help expand Levinas's philosophy to other faces otherwise than the human face. Thank you very much.